So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in our Beyond 6 Feet Apart expert webinar. We're going to be discussing today about legal issues related to reopening businesses. So just as a friendly reminder, there's a chat box on your right-hand corner where you'll be able to ask questions or comment, and then towards the end or throughout the webinar, we'll be able to answer your questions as we go. So now I'm going to leave Karen to take the stage and lead us to the presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this fourth webinar in our expert webinar series on reopening topics. We have a great speaker tonight, Priya Lane from the Lawyers for Civil Rights BizGrow program. We'll tell you a little bit more about her in a minute, but we'll start with a brief introduction to the Beyond 6 Feet Apart Accelerator and tonight's agenda. This is our agenda for the evening. And I should probably introduce myself, apologies. I'm Karen Kelleher, I'm the Executive Director of LISC Boston. LISC stands for Local Initiative Support Corporation. I have a slide or two where I'll tell you more about LISC if you're not familiar with us. But I have a partner in crime, Hitendra Patel, who's the Managing Director of the IXL Center, who will also help me introduce the program briefly, and then we'll move right into Priya's remarks and follow that with questions initially from the participants in the Beyond 6 Feet Apart Accelerator, and audience questions are invited through the chat box. So the Beyond 6 Feet Apart Accelerator program is a digitally enabled planning process for minority-owned businesses that want to retool safely and strategically in the wake of COVID-19. LISC partnered with an unusual partner for a nonprofit organization like us. The IXL Center is a global innovation company with unique roots in consulting and education. And IXL has worked with us and developed a digital tool that maps business processes, identifies safe solutions, and builds implementation plans. And they are training and supervising MBA students to provide consulting services to the participating businesses to help them develop their plan for a safe, strategic, and reopening or repositioning. So I want to introduce our colleague Hitendra Patel, who is also pictured on this slide, giving a TEDx talk about democratizing innovation, and ask him to share a little bit about the tool you've built and where this program fits into IXL's work.
Good, thank you, Karen, and welcome everybody to this event. Our objective is to democratize innovation, and so what we want to do is create tools that are scalable and shared across the globe. And so we quickly take methodologies which were developed at Harvard or MIT or at consulting firms like McKinsey or BCG, and we quickly reduce them into software tools that anybody can use very easily. And so we have a software tool for helping you identify safe unsafe journeys that you have inside your organization to make them safe. And there's an audit tool. The audit tool helps you identify solutions. The solutions now come from a database instead of you actually being brainstorming ideas. The ideas can be sourced from the database itself. And those ideas are collected from a global database because we have a global COVID-19 think tank of people around the globe who are putting answers into these things. And this way we accelerate the problem identification and the solution identification in a rapid way. We use students and who are MBA students to help you make this thing happen. And these MBA students are all basically configured to become consultants in the future, but we accelerate their training through training on how to be consultants. And now we match it all together. And now for almost a very low cost approach to a McKinsey type solution, a top consulting firm solution, we can deliver the same sort of results and outcomes in a much shorter, much faster way. And you know, we aim to do this globally and spread it out everywhere if we can. Thank you.
I'm gonna pitch it right back to you in a minute, HP, to talk about the 5 steps of the process, but I'll introduce the concept that we have 4 sectors represented in this cohort. They come from retail, professional services, food and beverage, and personal services. And they've been working together in groups by sector, sharing the solutions they're coming up with and learning from each other, as so many of us are trying to figure out how we, you know, sort of building a plane while we fly it and figuring out how to reopen businesses and reposition our businesses in this crisis. HP, would you like to talk about the process that they're being taken through?
Sure. What we know in any type of engagement for a company is the CEO or the founder has to be part of the process. So very early on, we put them in a room and say, look, is this something that you need to do, you want to do, and are you willing to support it? So setting the strategic direction of any business comes from the top down. And then we basically say, okay, let's look at the journey of any person who interacts with your business, customers, employees, suppliers. And we say, who are those people? And we create personas around them. We identify who they are. We kind of make them, humanize them. And then we create journey maps, journeys of how they interact in your organization. When a customer comes into your building, into your operations, how they interact with your people, how do they actually sit down and do whatever. And then from there, we identify hot zones, which are dangerous, unsafe for COVID-19 type of solutions. And then they basically identify solutions which are safe, and then ultimately an implementation plan. The objective of all of this thing is actionability for the owners at a low cost and easy to do, so that we can get people started as soon as possible. Now, having said that, that's not enough. On the implementation plan also, we have to put a communication plan. And the communication plan is, we are open, we are safe, please come to our businesses. And we are seeing that that's a very important component of what we have to do. It's not just fixing it, it's communication of it. And now we're also recognizing something else which is happening, that even if you're safe and you are communicating, we also need to think about what we were selling before. Maybe that has to be configured also. So there's all the learnings that comes out of this thing. It's a very short process, it's quick, and there's lots of learning in here, but we are all kind of basically learning through the process also. But because it's software, because there's consultants supporting you, there's hand-holding, everybody will start and finish this journey in a reasonable way with really good outcomes.
Thanks, HP. We do, as I said, have 4 sectors, and these are the terrific businesses that have been on this journey with us, teaching us as we go, and it's their work and the work of their consulting teams that have led to some of those insights that, that Hitendra just spoke of, that are causing us to adapt the program and adjust it, because what we're trying to build is a set of tools that could be used by others and scaled to help a lot more businesses at one time. So while we do expect to do another cohort, and that'll be a bigger cohort, what we really want to do is build tools that can be used by a lot of other providers to help businesses grow. And so that's both the COVID-19 adaptation, how do we adapt to this change and become safe and have a new strategy, but also what are the sort of digital capacities we need to build? What are the other sort of fundamental skill sets that minority-owned businesses need to build capacity at to be able to stabilize and grow, so that we can build out those tools as well. We've paired the tools and process that IXL has developed with this series, in those very practical topics of things like communications and digital tools that you need to use. How do you purchase PPE? Where do we find a vendor who's able to sell to small businesses and deliver reliably and sell at reasonable costs, because our businesses are so taxed by the costs of this crisis and the diminished demand, and in some cases have been completely shut down. We did start with reopening guidance, but we're going to end with financing your plan, which is so critical for so many of the businesses we're working with. That actually will be after the end of the creation of the implementation plans. We're going to postpone that because of the 4th of July holiday to July 8th, and hope that the participants in the current cohort will join us along with a larger audience and possibly the next cohort. A little tiny bit about LISC. We are one of the largest community development support organizations in the country. We have deep local roots though. LISC has been working in Massachusetts for over 35 years, but we have cohorts, we have peers in, it happens to be 35 other cities that similarly work with local organizations to meet local needs. We work in the creation and preservation of affordable housing, creation of health and resiliency in communities, creation of economic opportunity, which is where our small business work fits, and capacity building, which you hear that runs through all of our programs. We do prioritize equity in our investments and in our response to COVID-19, which we kind of put under the umbrella of our Rapid Relief and Recovery Fund for Massachusetts. We've had a number of initiatives, including this program, but also including emergency recovery grants for small businesses. We worked in coalition with 40 other organizations on something called the Mass Equitable PPP Access Initiative to help minority-owned businesses specifically get access to forgivable loans from the federal government that they got passed over on in the first round. We have our own financing products that we're consistently working and currently working very hard to develop into more flexible, more creative tools to better meet the needs of minority-owned businesses. And we do education and policy and advocacy, and it all is targeted at building out the small business ecosystem to be stronger and ultimately to increase the wealth and income of minority-owned businesses. Mass Growth Capital Corporation is a funder of this program, as is LISC, and we're grateful for their support. We couldn't be doing this without them. But tonight, we're going to focus on one of those practical issues that we haven't really discussed too much yet, which is legal issues related to reopening your business. As I said earlier, Priya Lane, attorney Priya Lane, is the director of BizGrow, which is a program of the Lawyers for Civil Rights, and they provide minority, immigrant, and women entrepreneurs with free legal assistance, technical support, and education so that they can develop sustainable businesses and be economically self-sufficient. Priya has significantly grown BizGrow and I think rebranded it and serves over 600 small businesses annually. 90% of those businesses are owned by people of color and 60% by women. So Priya represents many, many business owners just like those participating in this program and in this webinar. And she's going to share some of her general guidance about legal issues that small business owners need to address, but also her specific guidance about issues that are coming up right now as a result of COVID-19 and all of the challenges businesses are facing. She did create a flagship annual event for BizGrow, and I'll let her plug it herself in a minute, but there's a link right here on the slide, and we'll make these slides available, and in a minute we'll put this link into the chat. Maybe Maria's already done it. I can't see it right this minute. But this is a 6-hour program with multiple, I'll let her tell you about the details, but it's a ton of useful information for small business owners all on one day. They're putting a lot of work into creating an incredibly valuable program for you. So with no further ado, please allow me to introduce Priya. And I'm gonna stop sharing my slides.
Okay, and then I will share mine. Hi, everybody. I see and recognize a lot of names here, so it's nice to see everybody. As Karen said in that wonderful intro, my name is Priya Lane, and I direct a project at Lawyers for Civil Rights where we help minority, immigrant, and women-owned small businesses. I used to be a litigator at LCR, so I used to go to court, and then I got to switch and do really fun work helping people start small businesses and maintain small businesses. The one-day conference that Karen mentioned is called BizGrow, the BizGrow conference, and you'll have the opportunity to sign up for individual consultations with attorneys who practice in different subject matter areas, so intellectual property, taxes, real estate, corporate, contracts, whatever you have questions about. And then also we'll be running around 20 different webinars on different legal issues, some COVID specific, some general, throughout the day. Everything is completely free and it's all virtual this year, so we would love to have all of you there. And I think Maria put in the info in the chat. So I'm gonna go over some stuff that's a little bit general that a lot of you might already have some knowledge about, and then also some specific things to think about right now. This is going to be more interesting and better if people ask questions when they have them, so please don't hesitate. And this would be the time in the presentation where I asked all of you what entity you formed if I was in person, but I can't do that. I'm going to assume that a lot of you are either LLCs or S corporations. But if you have questions that I don't touch on, please ask them. So what's important about choosing an entity, an LLC, an S corporation, something like that? These are the factors that you're gonna wanna consider when either thinking about an entity you already have, when dealing with some sort of issue, or thinking about forming a new entity. So liability, the reason we create legal entities is to create something in front of us that can protect us personally from liability. So if you don't have an S corporation or an LLC or something like that, and you're selling, you're doing business, you're putting the money that you feed your kids, pay your mortgage, all that stuff, pay rent, you're putting that money at risk. If I form a legal entity, if I conduct my business in an LLC instead, then if that business gets sued, that money is what's at risk and my money is safe. That's of course if you're treating your entity right, and we're gonna get into that. Another issue is taxation. Different entities have different tax implications and structures and all that. Setup, entities have different setup issues, and then costs. A lot of you might not have entities because you're worried about the cost, right? An LLC is $500 a year, so that's not cheap. We have the most expensive LLC fees in the country in Massachusetts, so that's not cheap, but it is something that can protect you when you most need it. So I'm going to go right into corporations. If you haven't formed an entity, you're what's called a sole proprietor. We have a lot to cover, so I kind of took out those slides, but a sole proprietor doesn't have any of the legal liability protections that the forms of entities I'm going to touch on briefly do have. And so it's okay to be a sole proprietor, but you need to know that you're putting all of your assets at risk. But maybe you're young, you don't have a lot of assets, you don't have kids, you pay rent, you don't own, right? Maybe you're in a situation where you feel like your insurance policy that your business has is enough. And so that's sort of just a decision that you can make. And then as you grow larger, you can always form one of these entities that we're going to talk about. So a corporation is the type of company that you probably interact with the most in terms of big businesses, like I think Apple's a corporation, it might be an LLC, Google, things like that. So corporations are independent entities that are owned by shareholders. They're managed by boards of directors and officers. And then in your case, when you're starting out, that can most likely and will be all one person. So you can put your name in every single field when you're filling out your corporate documents. Corporations have limited liability for the shareholders. So that means the owners, you, have limited liability. So your liability is protected and the corporation has its own little bubble. Directors have to keep the best interest of the corporations in mind. And the thing about corporations that we don't like is that they have to pay taxes at the corporate level. So that means that $100 comes in a profit, say, you have to pay taxes on that money, right? The corporation itself files its own tax return, pays taxes on that money. Then you pay yourself all of the rest. So maybe there's $90 left, you pay yourself that, and then you pay income tax on that money. So you see how that same money goes through two levels of taxation. So we don't want that. That's not worth it when you're a small business. So you want to form an S corporation, which I'm assuming that the most of you who are corporations are S corporations. And to do that, you just form a corporation. And then by 3.5 months later, the 15th day of the 3rd month after you form the corporation, you tell the IRS, hi, my name's Priya, I formed this corporation, but I want you to tax me as an S corporation. And it's S because it's subsection S of the IRS code, right? And so that means if you're an S corporation, which is a special thing just for small businesses, it gets you out of that first level of taxation that we talked about, the corporate tax. So in that situation, if you're an S corporation, you make that $100 profit, and then all that $100 comes to you, and then you just pay your personal income tax on that. And so you see how as the money grows larger, maybe your tax bracket gets higher, an S corporation versus a C corporation, you're saving a lot of money by not paying taxes on the same money twice.
Yeah. We talked before about maybe taking questions along the way.
Karen?
That's your preference. Yeah.
You're coming across a little robotic.
There's some questions in the chat that I thought maybe Priya might like to take now to kind of get a conversation.
I'll take over if you want, Karen, until.
Please.
Thank you. So Priya, what Karen is saying is that we have questions popping up in the chat, and so as you mentioned that we can go along.
Yeah, I can't see the chat, so you tell me. Yes.
Great. So the first one, if I can interrupt right now, is from Frank. He's saying, Frank, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question directly, or I can just read it out loud.
Hi, Priya. This is Frank, Espresso Pizza in Lowell. The question really regards to, we understand that when you make the selection what kind of organization you want to be, you need to be, you consider liability, taxes, and the cost. But most people rely on their lawyer to do that. But the lawyers or the attorneys are not always well versed on the tax code. So shouldn't the business owner consult with the accountant and have the accountant and the lawyer have a conversation to choose what is the best entity for that person's situation?
So you could do that. But most of the entities that a small business is going to choose, the tax implications are similar, right? So an S corporation and an LLC, which are the two things you're considering against, both have the pass-through taxation, which I just talked about, which means you don't pay taxes at the corporate level. The only difference is going to be how you pay your own personal taxes and how what money of that is taxed, and I'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. And so if you have an accountant, bookkeeper, or a CPA would be best that you really trust, I would definitely have conversations with both. Know that a lawyer is always going to be more concerned about liability issues, probably, depending on what kind of lawyer you talk to. And an accountant might always be concerned about what's sort of easiest to file. And so always weigh the conversations against one another. And that's why sometimes it's good to have a conversation with a CPA, because they know a little bit more about the tax code than some accountants or bookkeepers do.
Thank you. When I bought my business, I also bought the building. So my accountant and attorney talked. The building is under Realty Trust and the business is under Subchapter S Corporation. And my accountant was fine with the structure based on my personal situation since I work outside of the business.
Good. Okay. Yeah. So it's always good to have a good team in any situation.
I'm going to try one more time. Am I robotic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So just another question, Priya, here. I don't, Maritz McLean, if you would like to unmute yourself. She's basically saying a comment, but I think you can elaborate on this.
Mm-hmm.
Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Hi, so I'm a family childcare provider in Fitchburg, and many of my colleagues, because of the pandemic and the liability that we are now facing, a lot of our insurance carrier just told us that they're not gonna they're going to exclude communicable disease in the liabilities. So a lot of them are really afraid to reopen their businesses. And then we are like talking about, what's the best way to protect our businesses from liability. And one of our colleagues said, talk to SCORE Mentor. It's I guess it's a federal program.
Yeah.
Okay. And he told me an LLC, but then I also asked advice from a well-known consultant who does a lot of training for family childcare providers, and he doesn't think that LLC will protect our assets. So I'm really confused.
Well, I mean, so if you treat you mean by assets, you mean your personal assets, right?
My personal assets, yes, because the SCORE mentor told me that if I get sued, that person can go after my husband's, 401k, retirement account.
Yeah, yes. So right now you don't have an entity, you're just a sole proprietor?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say, as a lawyer, right, that's a huge red flag. I would say, like, you definitely should consider forming an entity before reopening or before doing any business. I'm not sure about in what situation the other person who you spoke to was talking to you about, but if you form an LLC or an S corporation, but I prefer LLCs myself, right? So if you form the LLC and you treat it correctly, so you don't commingle funds, you don't, you treat the entity correctly, and I have a slide on that in a couple of slides.
Okay.
It should protect you if you were sued, your personal assets. And so that's the point. That's the whole point of this. And that's why, we pay $500 a year and we go through some of these hoops legally, because you want to make sure that your personal assets are safe. So an LLC should protect you. And if you are sued in your personal capacity, that's different, right? So if I'm sued, not my LLC, then that's different, right? Obviously. But if your LLC is sued and you're treating that correctly, then there's no reason why your personal asset should be at risk unless it falls within certain types of fraud and things like that, which, but that's normally like not paying your taxes or child support or things that the government places liens on you personally. But normally an entity would protect you.
And how is that going to affect like the tax deductions portion, the portion of my home for business?
Because you have a home-based daycare.
Yes.
It would be your deductions would be similar. So when you're an LLC owner, for tax purposes, you actually file very, very similarly to a sole proprietor. So again, definitely work with an accountant, a bookkeeper, CPA, to make sure, but your taxes and your deductions would be very similar with an LLC than what you're filing right now.
But first I have to file for to be an LLC.
Yes.
And can I still file with my husband? Because we always file our taxes together.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Great.
Just a quick question on that item. All right, so I believe that most attorneys that I have known, they go after the corporation, but they also sue the principal, because if there is a shortfall in the assets of the corporation, they then go to the principal's assets in order to supply the shortfall. Is that not true?
Well, so if you're sued in a personal capacity, but you're acting as the business owner, right? The suit against you would be dropped, right? So maybe you're sued, but you would tell the court, I shouldn't be sued in my personal capacity because I was just acting as the business. It's the business that's the proper party in the suit, and then they would hopefully drop you as personally. I was saying if you're sued in your personal capacity, like if you should be properly sued in your personal capacity. So if you got into a personal fight with someone or something like that, that was not business oriented.
Okay. Frank said thank you. He was muted, but I could read what he was saying. No worries, Frank. And there's another just question, Priya, here before we jump back to your slides. From Muriel from Black Boston. I don't know, Muriel, if you're there, or if you'd like me to read out the question.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I was just asking a general question. If I was a subchapter S, but wanted to go to a C-Corp, and the only reason I can think of that is because I may want to have, stockholders in the C-Corp that I can't get in a subchapter S. Is there what's that like, going from a sub S to a C-Corp?
It's easy. So you would just basically, the way you told the IRS 3.5 months after you filed, or before that you wanted to be taxed as an S-Corp, they're more than happy to get more taxes from you and for you to tell them, no, I want to go back and I want to be taxed as a C-Corp. That first year you do it, your taxes will be a little confusing, and you need to definitely make sure you work with someone who knows what they're doing there to help you file that first year, because it won't, unless you do it cleanly, right? For part of the year, you'll have to pay more taxes, and for the rest of the year, but it's no problem. And also, like if your business gets so big that you no longer qualify to be an S corporation, then that would automatically happen anyway. So that's something that the law sort of foresees as an option.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Great.
Priya, another question, if that's okay. This is Marites McLean. You said that your company, BizGrow, is helping minority-owned businesses. Can you help me set up my LLC, your company then?
Yes.
How can I contact you?
So maybe we can send out my contact info to everyone. But
Yes.
the best thing to do right now, and the way I would sort of gear you towards right now, would be to sign up for that big conference we have in 3 weeks. Because I can get you an attorney, but not as quickly as that conference coming up. So that's
okay.
The way to get in front of an attorney for me right now. And then afterwards, once you talk to them for half an hour, you pick an entity or whatever you decide in that conversation, then we can go back to that attorney and say, would you like to represent them to do this pro bono? And
Okay.
say yes. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm signing up for it now.
I hope all of you do.
Yes, and I have a large group of family childcare providers on Facebook, and I can post the link.
Please do. That'd be great.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Priya. So back to you, Priya. You can continue.
So I think that Merle kind of hinted at some of the downsides to S corporations, right? So it only has that single level of taxation, so that's good, but only humans can be owners, right? So other corporations or trusts or LLCs can't own S corporations. So if you want to, have like a holding company, you can't do that with an S corporation. Only US citizens or permanent residents can be holders. I think owners, that's probably the most negative for the clients that I work with. And also because no non-US citizens can invest. So if you have family from overseas or here who are not here, either they're not undocumented or they're not a permanent resident, they can't invest in the business. And, that's often where a lot of people get their first rounds of investments, right? Their family. And also you can't have more than 100 owners. And that's a pretty big number. So that's normally not an issue, but you can't issue more than 100 shares basically. And you can only have one class of stock. That's an issue if you want to get financing from certain places. Just probably LISC would be able to speak a little bit better on this, but a lot of places where you get financing from, they might want a special class of stock, which means they get paid first normally, or maybe they get paid twice, or maybe they get paid a bigger amount than other shareholders. And so that's why sometimes an S corporation doesn't work and people go the formal C corporation route right from the beginning because they're looking to that kind of investment.
Hey, Priya, can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, this is better. Yeah.
I will chime in on that point, not the specific point about particular type of entity, but I want to talk but call out the issue of getting financing, which is so challenging for so many small businesses and particularly minority-owned businesses. I can tell you for sure you're not going to get financing if you have not formed an entity. The issues that Priya has talked about will make it just unacceptable to any lender or equity investor. I think that, to kind of pivot to a COVID-related issue, I think these kinds of issues of kind of getting your legal house in order and your compliance house in order really help businesses build capacity and be more stable in a crisis and avoid some of the worst cases. And so one of the links with COVID is from a liability perspective. God forbid you should have somebody try to sue you because of COVID liability. You want to know that you've got all the liability protections in place that you can. So I know, Priya, you want to get to some of the other topics you have, including insurance, which is very important in that liability protection.
Yeah. Okay, so LLCs are the other kind of entity. LLC owners are called members. So if you ever hear someone called an LLC member, that just is a fancy word for owner. LLCs also have the limited liability. It also only has the one level of taxation. you should have a comprehensive operating agreement. LLCs are really more free form. Less documents you have to file, less structure that has to be in place. And LLCs are a little bit more expensive than corporations at $500 a year. And you pay every year on the anniversary that you filed. So the one thing with an LLC that's a little different for tax purposes is that when you're a S corporation or corporation, excuse me, you're a employee, so you get paid just the way you would get paid when you're an employee working for someone else. You can run your paycheck through payroll. An LLC is a little different. All profits are automatically just sort of, for tax purposes, kind of put on the members in proportion to how much they own. So if there's only one of you, all profits are automatically shown on your tax return as something that you owe money on. And so even if you put all that money back into the LLC, you still have to, that's where you pay your taxes. You have to pay taxes on that profit. And so if you don't take any of that money out, what the LLC does is it'll just give you just the right amount of money to pay your personal tax return. And so everyone's sort of even. And this is for everyone. If you have an entity, if you don't have an entity, just some important things. If you need an EIN, which is an employment identification number, which is sort of like a social security number for your business, you should not pay for it. It's free. So anything you find online that's asking you to pay for it is a waste of money. So don't pay anyone for it. You just go to the irs.gov website and you just fill out a very simple form. I get like an EIN almost weekly for one of my clients. It's very simple. You just click through and then it's automatically produced at the end. You are also supposed to have a doing business as or a DBA with all the cities that you're conducting business in. The DBA does not provide you any of the limited liability that I talked about earlier. That's a very common misconception among small businesses like yourself. And so I like to mention it anytime I talk about anything. The DBA is you telling the city, my name is Priya, and I'm doing business as cupcakes, 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 right? So that means that the city of Medway, where I live, knows that if someone is looking for cupcakes, 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 that means they should come to Priya. The DBA does not provide me with any legal protection. It's just mandatory that I tell the city, unlike the LLC and the S corporation, which provides me with limited liability protection and which I form with the state of Massachusetts. Okay. Do not commingle funds. I put that in really big letters because that is the main reason why people lose their really hard-earned limited liability protection from these small from these entities that they're forming. Don't treat your business bank account like a piggy bank. Don't, if you're putting money in, which you're going to have to, put it in your books as a loan and only take money out when it's for business expenses, not for your personal groceries and stuff like that. Because when a court sees you move money back and forth, they say, she's not treating it like a real business. She's treating it like a hobby. Why should I treat it like a real business? And that's when you lose your limited liability protections. Another thing that will erode your your limited liability protections is personal guarantees. I know, right? I'm a lawyer, so I would tell you never sign a personal guarantee, but I know since I work with small businesses that is next to impossible, right? You're going to have to sign personal guarantees for a lot of your loans. You're going to have to sign personal guarantees for when you lease space for the first time because your business doesn't have any assets. But try to keep it at a minimum is my advice. Okay. We're going to go really briefly through IP. A lot of you who have restaurants often come to me and ask me how you keep your recipes a secret. The answer to that is that they're trade secrets. So you're literally just keeping them a secret. The Coke formula is an example of a trade secret, which is why I have the Coke logo on here. It just means that you need to be careful and keep your recipes to yourself. And when you have to share them with employees, have them sign non-disclosure agreements or something along those lines to make sure that you're keeping the thing that is valuable to your business safe. Trademarks are the most common form of intellectual property that you'll all probably be interested in at one point or another, and that is the name of your business or the logo or something like that. And so my advice on trademarks is that wait until your business has something worth stealing before you become overly concerned about your trademark. I think that that's also something that lawyers won't normally tell you. Lawyers are really cautious and would say, like, get your trademark right away. But there's a lot of things that small businesses are being asked to spend their money on every day. And, you know, depending on your business, getting a federal trademark for the name might not be high up on your list. But if it's something you're interested in, I'm happy to talk more about it. And then copyright is basically just the protection of written work is copyright. And so the only reason I put information about this on is that it's really easy to put a copyright notice at the bottom of your web pages right now. So you don't have to register copyrights to be able to put the copyright notice. So if you look down here, and I have an example. So you would literally put this C in the circle, the year 2020, and then either your name or the name of your business, depending on if you have an entity or not. So if I had a written work that I wrote in my personal capacity, it would say Priya Lane. If I had a Cupcakes LLC, then that's what I would put in here, okay? And you should all go, and if that's not at the bottom of your website, you should make sure that that's at the bottom of your website, because that's just a way to look a little bit more professional and protect sort of the written work on your website. Okay, employment law. Does anyone have any questions that I missed, Karen? Yeah?
Nope, I think you're good. Keep going. Let's get some other issues on the table. And then
Okay, so employees versus independent contractors is a huge issue that we hear about all the time. The bad news for you guys is that in Massachusetts, we have the strictest laws about independent contractors versus employees. Basically, an employee is anyone who serves at your direction, right? So if you are a hairdresser and you hire someone to cut hair, they do the same thing you do, so technically they're an employee. If you bake cakes and you hire someone to make your website, well, you don't know how to make websites, right? You just know, I want my website to look like this and to do these things by this date. That person is an independent contractor. And so if they are doing the same thing as me, and I am controlling like the minute details of what they're doing, they're an employee in Massachusetts, and you have to pay them benefits, you have to withhold taxes, give them a W-2, all of that stuff. If they're doing something totally different to your business, then they are an independent contractor and you can issue them a 1099. Minimum wage is $12.75 right now in Massachusetts. It'll keep going up every year until it's 15. You guys have to pay employees at their normal rate and then 1.5 times once they work overtime. And you have to deduct the normal deductions and then any other deductions that they've authorized for everyone. So you have to basically treat everyone the same way. Some COVID specific stuff. So furloughs. So if you furlough your employees, that means you continue to pay them benefits, but you don't continue to pay them wages, right? So that's what a furlough means. Laying off is completely separating yourself. So like firing in a nice way is laying off, right? It's completely separating them from your business. Massachusetts has something called the Mass Work Share program, which is a way to basically furlough your employees and pay them also a little bit. So say you have 2 employees, but you only have the business right now for 1, but you want to keep both because you know things are looking up, business is going to pick up again. What you can do is you can continue paying the benefits for both and then give them each 50% time, pay them 50% of their wages, and then they can go through the Massachusetts Workshare program to get the other 50%. And obviously those percentages can change and stuff depending on what you need. And then as you guys probably know, we have special unemployment assistance right now called pandemic unemployment assistance, where more employees can get unemployment. You guys can get unemployment. 1099 gig workers can get unemployment, and also unemployment assistance right now for your employees will be expedited. And for now, at least, they will get some extra money from the federal government that they would not have gotten under normal circumstances. Does anyone have any questions about furloughs, layoffs?
Yeah, Priya, you have a comment from May Restaurant. I don't know if it's Irene, do you want to chime in?
Hi, everyone. I was just going to share that when we first, ended up facing the pandemic, we went through the whole Workshare application process, but it ended up not being necessary because there is a calculator on the state website that basically shows you how much you can pay an employee before they become totally ineligible for unemployment. So a lot of our staff are working between like 10 and 25 hours, and they still get some employment from Massachusetts and then the 600 from the federal government. So if folks want to avoid like the Workshare paperwork, basically, that's a great way to do it.
And Irene has a really good point that right now with the 600 extra, you can do some math and try and figure out like which one of the 3 will get you the most benefits. And it's annoying, right? And like it's a little bit unwieldy. But sadly, that 600 is not going to last forever. But since it's an option right now, and I knew that you guys had done that and like that, it can make a little more sense. So there's some ways to sort of work the system now. Hopefully this is not an issue as much on everyone's mind as we're kind of going back to work, but these are all.
Priya, can I ask, how does this additional funds, if anything at all, how does it affect their taxes next year, that additional federal money?
They don't really know. So like, it probably won't affect it in any real, I'm not a tax attorney, I'm supposed to say that. It probably won't affect it in any real way. They don't know because it's sort of a new thing, and I'm assuming the IRS will have got more guidance on it as next year's taxes roll around.
So we don't know if it's going to actually be considered income. And
I don't think it will be considered income because most pandemic relief stuff has not been considered income so far. So going under that idea, right? Like, so all the grants that everyone's getting and stuff on the whole, if coming from the federal government has not been considered taxable income. But since unemployment is they'll have to release more guidance for us to be sure.
thank you.
In a way, Priya, the grants may not be considered income, but the expenses that they are paying for are not expenses, so you're going to be taxed one way or the other.
Well, yes, but hopefully, I mean, this is a weird hope, but you're all probably operating at a little bit of a loss this year, so you'll be able to write most of it off. And I put in this slightly depressing slide. I would normally never talk about this, but I've been getting a lot of questions, and it's better to kind of know what you're going into, right? So if you do want to dissolve the business, there's, just some easy things to keep in mind. If you can't pay off your debts and you're declaring bankruptcy, that's a whole different issue that I'm not going to get into. But if you can sort of deal with your creditors, and that's not the worry, dissolving businesses doesn't have to be hard or scary. you have to first discharge all those debts and liabilities. And so if you can't do that, then you have to go the bankruptcy route, and that's a different conversation. And then the rest of the assets that's left, you just want to liquidate as much as possible, right? You want to make as much stuff cash as you can. And then if you're the only owner, you're good. If you are not the only owner, you distribute that in proportion to ownership. And then depending on your entity type, you might have to file some further paperwork with the state, formally dissolving your LLC, your S corporation, all of that stuff. But we're getting a lot of questions about that, so I thought I would put that in there.
Priya, just a question. If you have to look into discharging all your debts and liability, should you focus first on paying the government obligations? Because I don't believe that those are discharged under the bankruptcy laws, correct?
Yeah, so yes, if you owe taxes to the IRS, that's always going to be harder to discharge. So liens against you from the government are probably always going to be the most complicated. But if you can't pay off all your creditors or you can't negotiate with all your creditors, I would encourage you to talk to an attorney about bankruptcy and sort of the best way to figure out everything before spending all your money. Okay, any questions about that stuff before we move on?
There's one more question. It's actually going back a little bit. It's really about entity formation from Black Boston. Do you want to chime in with your question? It's a little more optimistic than the succession slide.
Okay, yes. In terms of like years of service, that question comes up on certain financial forms, bank forms, grant forms. So let's say you got 4 years as a sole proprietor, but now you form a Schedule C. Can you go ahead and say, yeah, I've been around 5 years, even though you just formed the Schedule C yesterday?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, Karen might think opposite as somebody who gives loans, but yeah. I mean, a sole proprietor is a valid business. It's just not a legal entity in the same way. But if you were in business, then yeah, I would count it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it depends. As a lender, you'd be looking for an established, financial pattern of financial statements. So, like, how much revenue have you had in your business for 3 years? If I see 3 years of revenue, okay, I don't need to know that you were in the same business entity. If it's the same business, but you've actually just formed an entity to protect your business against liability. I would be pleased to see that, and it would make me think you're more stable, but I'm looking for something other than that legal entity when I ask that question.
Okay, great.
So contracts, I know all of you are wondering about a lot of your contracts. I thought we'd start in this sort of basic place, right? What is a contract? Contract is an agreement between 2 or more parties that is legally enforceable. A contract can be written, it can be oral. Contracts do not have to be written. As Karen and some other people who went to law school can attest, it has to have a consideration, which you spend a whole semester on for no reason in law school, but is basically means that both sides have to give up something. So if I enter into a contract with Tina and I say, Tina has to bring me cupcakes, and I don't have to give her anything, right? That's not a contract. That's just me trying to get her to give me cupcakes, right? But if I entered into a contract and I said, you have to bring me cupcakes and I have to give you $500, suddenly she loses cupcakes, I lose money, and we have a deal, right? And that's a contract. So some contracts have to be written, sales of goods over $500 and leases with payments over $1,000. And if you are writing a contract, which is probably in your best interest, make really sure that all the terms are written there. So don't say, oh, we wrote most of it down and then we talked on the phone and we came up with this other stuff and like, it's fine. Everybody knows. Like if you have it written, make sure that everything, like the whole universe of what you've talked about is on the written document. That can only ever do you good. You want example terms and conditions, right? Terms, how long is the agreement in effect? Can it be terminated early? Price and how payment will be made. Time of performance, right? When do I get the cupcakes? procedures for waiving and amending. As we all know, now things can change really suddenly, and we want to know how to change our contracts. Governing law, which would be a simple sentence if you have a really fancy contract that says something like, this contract will be governed under the laws of the state of Massachusetts. And then the integration clause is basically a sentence that says, this is the final agreement, right? So this is like, as of this date, this is where we're at, and we're going forward with this. Does anyone have any questions about contracts before I move on to leases, which are a specific type of contract for real estate?
We don't have any in the chat box.
A lot of the contracts have a termination clause to terminate early. Is there any limit on how much a compensation can be established to terminate something early?
Oh, I don't know. Does anyone know the answer to that question? Karen, do you know?
I have to admit, I was reading the chat box and I didn't hear the full question. What's the to terminate the contract? What was the first part of the question, Frank?
Yeah, the question was, a lot of contracts have a termination clause. Is there a maximum compensation that can be stipulated to terminate the contract early?
There probably is in the UCC, which is like the law that governs contracts. But more likely, right, the other side isn't going to agree if it's ridiculous. And so
a lot of leases have unusual termination clauses that penalizes somebody from terminating early, and it's the reason why a lot of businesses don't want to get out of the lease, because the clauses kill them. If they get out, they have to pay so much.
Well, leases, yeah, leases are different, right? Leases, they can say you have to keep paying your rent for as long as you're here. So that's a special kind of contract. But yes, but you know, contracts, hopefully, right, both sides come to the table with the similar amounts of power, and hopefully both sides, at least when the contract is signed, is happy.
Yeah, Priya, you outed me as a recovering lawyer, so I'll pretend to be a lawyer still. But and I was corporate counsel. I was an affordable housing lawyer by way of disclaimer, though I was in-house counsel for a mid-sized company for 10 years. But I would say a lawyer, if you were trying to get out of a provision that was incredibly onerous that prevented you from terminating, could make arguments about undue influence or not having equal bargaining power. You would get creative. I'm not personally aware of a particular limitation, like in lending contracts, there's a limitation on how much interest you can charge, but I'm not aware of a general limitation that applies to all contracts on termination provisions. But you offer a question that offers a good segue into talking about leases. We do have a question from Frank about COVID liability release forms that we're gonna, let's defer until you get to insurance, or whenever you wanna talk about it.
Let's talk about it now, because I don't have a slide on insurance, so that we can just take a break before commercial leases. So, so a lot of businesses right now are kind of assuming that they're going to need these COVID liability waivers, right? Which would look something like having your clients come in, sign, you know, I won't sue you if I get sick from whatever interaction we're about to have. We can't help you with that at Lawyers for Civil Rights, because it poses a conflict for us, because we do a lot of employment law and represent employers. And so that is a little bit of a conflict for us. So I can only talk about this very generally. But that is what a lot of businesses are sort of talking about right now, and it's a little bit in the news too. And so my hope would be that you don't need that because you have a really strong insurance policy. Because one, lawyers aren't sure if those kinds of contracts are even legally enforceable, right? So even if you were sued because someone claimed that you didn't follow protocols for keeping your place clean or something, right? If that was the basis of the suit, there is it's not clear to lawyers, since this is also new, whether a suit like that, even if you had a waiver, that waiver would really stand up. Because courts like to only enforce contracts that they believe is for public policy. And so a lot of lawyers think that's not going to be something that courts would enforce, because it's not really going for the public policy of, you know, public health and things like that, to allow disclaimers like that, both in the context with consumers and in the employment context. So my hope is that all of you call your insurance brokers and your insurance companies and find out exactly what liability protection you have. You all have, I'm hoping, really good general liability insurance at a minimum, right? And what that covers in relation to customers. If your insurance company says, we, as someone said earlier, I'm sorry, I forgot your name with the daycare, right? That the insurance company said, we're not covering infectious diseases, which just is COVID now, right? Then I would encourage you to shop around to other policies, because one, shopping for insurance is always good because they tell each other who shops and your rates will go down if you shop. But two, there should be really no reason why that shouldn't be covered, because just because it's new, just because it's now a problem doesn't mean that it shouldn't be covered. And so I know that might not be the answer you wanted, but I think that is sort of the most realistic view of what's going on right now.
I'm not sure you would have the answer, but is COVID considered an act of God?
Okay, yeah. So I do want to talk about that. So force majeure, right? That is the contract clause. It's like act of God. And so that is going around a lot where, you know, I couldn't perform on this contract because I wasn't allowed to leave my house because the governor said I couldn't, right? So that's an act of God. And so an attorney who represents me would say that's definitely an act of God. She should get out of that contract. An attorney representing the other side would say, no, that's not an act of God. And so there is a lot of debate on whether force majeure counts right now in coronavirus. I would say that you can make good arguments on either side, depending on what side you need.
Priya, can I chime in? I don't have a question from the chat, but we started this webinar series with reopening guidance, and it is not a complete protection against liability, just like a waiver isn't, and insurance is a great idea, but if you have a lot of entities that haven't formed an entity, chances of insurance being in place for a lot of them, I suspect, is low. So it's something to move towards for your business. And if you can afford it now, don't wait. But following the guidance of local authorities, the state guidance, the regulatory guidance will be helpful to you should you ever be in that situation. Yeah. And it sends a message to your customers also. Whether you get sued sometimes depends a lot on how you interact with your customers, right? You're creating a relationship of trust and showing them how careful you're being on their behalf, rather than showing that you're not concerned about it. And there's a lot of difference out there as we all go out into businesses that have recently reopened. Some are being very, very thorough, and others are going about business as usual. Hopefully, anybody who's gone through this program is going to be in the former category, though going through this program is also no protection against liability. There's the lawyer in me.
Yeah, and I just, like, from a consumer standpoint, right, I second that. If I go in and I see you cleaning, I see you wearing a mask, I see you doing all the things that, like, I think you're supposed to do, then I'm less likely to feel like I got sick from you than if I go in there and you're coughing all over the place, you know? And so it's also just consumer perception. So yes, I think that's a great point. Leases. I'm assuming at least some of you have commercial leases. They are not like residential leases. So we have a lot of protections in Massachusetts with residential leases. Commercial leases are more like contracts. Having a written lease is really vital. Otherwise, your rights are more limited. I know some of you might not have written leases. I think that is, like Karen said, something to work towards. Having a written agreement with your landlord protects your rights. Basic terms: landlord, tenant, description, what you pay each month is the base rent, and then you might pay more for common areas. You'll know how long the lease is for in a written lease. You want to make sure that leases always permit the planned use of the space, and you want to, as the lessee, right, the person leasing the space, you want to make sure that you have the broadest use provision possible. So think about all the things you might want to do there, and I would make that really broad. So because sometimes if you want to change the use, you would have to get permission, and we don't want to have to keep going to our landlords for permission. So we want a broad use. Also, if you want to sublet or assign, right? Like all those things could have been useful in situations like this. I know a lot of people who had small office space who have started working from home who were like, I can just work from home. I don't need that small office space anymore. And now would be interested in subletting, but possibly didn't have that in their lease and have had to negotiate with their landlord. So rent relief during COVID-19. I'm assuming a lot of you have been hoping and trying to negotiate with your landlord to get some rent relief during this time when you couldn't be open. Negotiating is always better than just announcing with them that you're not going to pay. So there's a lot of different things. You could say, can I defer? So can I pay later when I'm open, depending on what phase your business is in? You might be in that phase where you're starting to open. So maybe you had said earlier, I can't pay now. I don't have any business coming in. Let me start paying when my customers come back, and we'll just tack on those months that I was not open to the rest of the rent, and we'll extend the term or something. Abate, which is the better of the two options, is like, can I just not pay rent during this portion that I'm not using the space? Landlords, I've seen landlords across the board during this time period. Some landlords have been very, very willing to work with their tenants. Some have been saying, I'm happy, to let you just not pay it. So I've seen the whole range of landlords. You would want to add an amendment to your lease to sort of commemorate whatever agreement you guys make. A note on this: if your landlord doesn't own the space yet completely, if your landlord still has a mortgage on the space, they might allow you to not pay rent, to abate rent for a couple of months, but their lender, the bank, might not allow them to allow you to do that. And so that might be kind of a problem with a really great relationship that you just can't do anything about, because they can't do anything about it. Right now in Massachusetts, we have a moratorium on commercial, that should say evictions, not leases, sorry. We have a moratorium on commercial evictions. So we can't be evicted from our commercial space. Massachusetts never has self-help eviction, so they can never come and just change your locks. That's always illegal in Massachusetts. Right now, because of the governor's order, they cannot evict for non-payment of rent from April 20th through August 18th, or 45 days after emergency declaration has been lifted. If that happens before August 18th, I do not foresee that necessarily happening before. Also, this might very well be extended past August 18th. So that means that landlords are now not allowed to impose late fees, notify credit reporting agencies, as long as the tenant told them that I am not paying because of impacts due to COVID-19, which is most of the reason why we're not paying. This doesn't mean that the landlord can't try to recover lost rent from earlier. So that means that later, after this is lifted, they might still try to evict you, or they will still try to get your rent. So it's not it's not solving the problem completely, but it is pushing it off a little bit.
I have a question. How can a tenant learn if a landlord has been given some relief? Because I would expect if a landlord got relief, then that relief would then trickle down to the tenant. So if a landlord got 2 months relief, then the tenant should get 2 months relief. How does a tenant know that, or what's their way of learning that? Is it just a relationship with your landlord that you hope that they'll be honest?
Yeah, banks have not been that great about mortgage relief, so I don't know how many landlords are actually getting relief, but it's always good to have a good relation. It's always good to have the best relationship as possible from your landlord, obviously. I actually normally advise clients, like, don't get, like, talk to lawyers, but don't have a lawyer call your landlord until, like, it's too late, because you want to have kind of as good of a relationship as humanly possible, because you don't know what's going to happen and when they might be saying, like, oh, I feel bad for small businesses right now, don't pay March. But to answer your question, I wouldn't know. Karen, do you have any?
I think it would be very difficult to obtain that information with a private landlord. If you happen to have a public landlord, you might be able to get that information in some way, shape, or form. But the lending transaction that they got relief through is a private transaction, most likely. So everything would be case specific. The other sort of thought or question I might have is Priya, you told me earlier that a lot of the calls and issues you're seeing since COVID are lease related. And so I'm curious what you're seeing and how those situations are playing out. Because if I were a landlord of commercial space at this point, I might be pretty patient, because as much as I do want to get paid and I need to get paid because I have costs I have to pay, I also don't have a lot of confidence that there's another tenant dying to knock down the door and rent that space at a higher rent. So
yeah, so this is a good place. It doesn't feel like it. This is a really good place to be a renter, right? Not only is there this moratorium on evictions, it's not like a really crazy market where someone else is going to fill your spot. And also it's not clear to housing attorneys or other attorneys that work with commercial evictions whether, when these evictions do eventually take place in September or whenever, if judges are going to be super, into evicting these small businesses. More likely a judge will say, like, I don't want to deal with any evictions that happened would have happened during the moratorium. You go figure it out. Who knows, right? But if that's the case, the landlord doesn't have a ton of bargaining power like they normally do. So this is a good space to be in when, like, it's not me, right? It's not my business. It's everyone. And, like, you look like a heartless soul if you don't, like, work with me a little bit on this.
So what do you think a tenant's options are with that power dynamic and market dynamic? What kinds of options might you go to your landlord with to try to get through this crisis and get your business back on its feet? How might you negotiate with a landlord, Priya?
Yeah, and I would go, the best, like, as we've been seeing sort of like hundreds of these negotiations take place, the most successful have been when you don't bury your head in the sand, which is, like, so tempting nowadays, believe me, I know. But, like, very proactively go to your landlord and say, look, as you know, business is down. This is what I'm thinking. What do you think about this payment plan? Like, be organized, look at the numbers, figure out what both you can do and what seems fair, right? If the landlord drives by and they see that, like, you have a restaurant and, like, people are sitting in there now and, like, you've got a bustling patio of social distanced, people eating, they're going to get annoyed if you keep telling them that you have no business. And so, lay it out from March through June. I was totally closed and was making no business. For these 3 weeks, I've been making this percentage of revenue. I would try to be as transparent with them as possible, and say, like, you're trying to get them money, but like you have a lot of bills and you're trying to keep this business afloat because you want to have a long-term relationship with them. On a larger policy level, right, I would hate to see the small businesses that we work with give all of their money that they have right now to their landlords. And so trying to negotiate something that can be tolerable to both parties, where the landlord feels like in the end they're still getting, you know, close to what they wanted, right? Maybe you extend your lease with them if you think that that's smart for your business, or, you know, work out something with them. But just not paying, and especially not paying while you start the business again, will just make the landlord angrier and angrier.
I want to encourage those of you on the call to let us know in the chat if you have a question or just a situation you're facing that you think might be germane to our topic here, so that because I think those are some of the most interesting discussions when we hear what's really going on with your business, so that we can help you think that through. But meanwhile, I'm going to ask you a question that one of our business owners sent me earlier today. I think she has logged off, though she was here. Nikia Landi, are you still here? She's the owner of Intriguing Hair. And her question, chime in if you're here, Nikia, but I checked and I think she's gone, was about insurance. And you talked about liability insurance. And I don't recall if you touched upon this. I didn't hear it. She asked whether D&O coverage, directors and officers liability coverage, is important. So apologies if I missed it and you did talk about that. And I'll add another type of coverage because we do have some professional services businesses in our cohort. What about professional liability insurance?
So a lot of those are business specific, right? I think with directors and officer and professional liability insurance, it's really specific. I'm a lawyer, so I have to have malpractice insurance, right? I can't practice without it. So some industries, like your malpractice insurance is what gives you all of the coverage. I work with some therapists. They have such good malpractice insurance that they sometimes, you know, the LLC formation is sometimes like a secondary concern because, you know, they're covered so highly with their insurance. And so depending on your business, it can be really important. It can be crucial. Same with directors and officer insurance. It depends a little bit about your entity type. It depends how many different people are involved with your business. If you were everything and you were already covered through something else, maybe you don't need directors and officer insurance. If you're a nonprofit, maybe you do need it. And so for all of these things, I normally say shop around and talk to an insurance broker, not a company, but a broker who can like talk to all the different companies and know all the types of insurance. And don't just get like a huge umbrella policy that has a ton of stuff you don't need, but try to get exactly what you need and only that, and really like more than enough for what you need. Does that make sense? So if you're going to pay X amount of dollars, I would rather that money be like in really robust policies for exactly what you need, rather than have all these different types of insurance for stuff that your business doesn't do.
Probably should add that lending partners caveat that when you go to try to get financed, your lender may be looking for certain kinds of insurance coverage, because of course they're depending on your business to generate revenue, and they need to know you're protected against the kinds of risks we've been talking about tonight. So we're getting close to the end of our time. I want to put out a last call for questions or specific situations. I see Hitendra Patel has his hand up. And then Priya, at the end, I'm going to ask you what, if you could only give one piece of advice to every business in this moment in COVID times, what would it be? Hitendra?
All right, sorry about
Brian,
that. Hi, Priya, thank you. Really helpful. My question is, we're trying to get businesses up and operational now, and they've become safer to a large extent. But there's a concern, how to make sure the customers, when they come in, they're safe, and employees are safe, and what's the liability on them somehow getting sick and linking it back to the business for whatever reasons. And so is there a risk to the business? Should we be worried? What kind of protection can we make to make sure that we can welcome our customers and still do our businesses, welcome our employees and still do our
Can I call you
work?
back? I'm on the meeting right now. Should be over in about 5-10 minutes.
Okay.
Thanks, Frank.
hey, Frank, you got to mute.
I muted.
Yes. So I think the short answer is yes. There's as you know, there could definitely be liability concerns. My advice would be to not do anything until you're ready, for one, right? And so if your business, you're not sure if you have the PPE to open, wait, right? It's not the time to cut corners on stuff like this. If you think maybe your employees can still work from home, like think about productivity like this, right? If I'm at 75% productivity working from home and my employees feel safe, then that might be worth it, right? And it might not be time to get them up to 100 until they feel ready to come back to work and they feel safe and you feel comfortable that you know exactly what you're supposed to do as a business owner to keep them safe. So I would, and I think that City of Boston, State of Massachusetts, I think a lot of entities are giving the same advice right now that I think is smart. We're all in a hurry to go back to work. We're all in a hurry to get stuff normal and to start making money again. But try to scale it in a way that you can try to keep as safe as possible and keep your employees and your employers, your employees and your customers safe. Because if the health department comes and closes you down, you're gonna lose a lot more customers for a long time than if you just took the time to reopen when you were ready.
No, I understand, Priya, but my question is, somebody's providing guidance on waivers. I got my haircut. I did. and they made me sign a document saying that we'll give you a haircut. You got to sign this before you come in. And I signed a waiver, and I'm happy to do it. I'm not going to go create a problem for them. But somebody's giving a guidance that these waivers are an appropriate process step for welcoming customers into the business. And I'm just wondering if there's any guidance provided by the city or through legal that where this is coming from, or is it people being smart, thinking that might cover them?
So yeah, this is it's kind of hip in a weird way right now to have these waivers. So this is sort of what I was talking about earlier, where I can't advise personally on it because it's a conflict for us internally at LCR. But this is a thing where I think it is providing both this possibly false sense of security for both businesses and customers, right? That I've signed this document and it means something. Well, we're not really sure in the legal community if those are enforceable in court. I'm assuming we'll find out soon enough. But right now, even if I was allowed to advise on them, I would say be cautious as to your belief of the efficacy of these waivers, because until we see more actual suits with these waivers involved, I wouldn't feel comfortable even knowing either way what a court would say about them.
Thank you.
I chime in with a practical perspective on them, and then I'm gonna go to you, Frank. And Priya, that will give you enough time to think about your one piece of advice. But I'm not sure there's a lot of harm, right? If I were taking a belt and suspenders approach, I might get one. It's a way of saying, I'm thinking about this, I'm being thoughtful. What's the risk? Maybe you might create a heightened level of concern on the part of a customer or a supplier, because you're not saying, here's all the things I'm doing to be safe. You're saying, I don't want any liability. You come in at your own risk. So I think you have to balance those two practical issues about the message you're sending and how it affects your customers. But I think Priya's advice that you shouldn't rely on the waiver, to think that that waiver is actually going to protect you from liability while not doing the other things we've talked about, then you're going to have a false sense of security. And I think she's trying to be very clear that she can't give you that sense of security, but there's no harm other than those kinds of sort of impressions that you're presenting to your customers. If you're doing all the other things right, then it may just be an added protection. Should there be a lawsuit, you have gone through some process of saying, there's risk, I've done all these things, and I'm trying to protect you, but I can't control a global pandemic. And so I just want to make sure I'm protecting my business and want you to be careful yourself. So that would be my practical thought.
In conjunction with that, something I've seen just as a customer that I think is really impressive is I really like when businesses are super proactive with telling us what they're doing. And even if it's just like the normal customer does not know the guidance, right? And so even just if you're saying like, I am doing A, B, C, and D, you know, I'm like, oh, wow, that seems like a lot of stuff, right? Even if you're required to do that by law, like put it out there, like be really proactive about telling people what you're doing to keep them safe, because that can only make customers feel better.
Thank you.
Frank Carvalho. You're muted.
I muted myself at the wrong time, huh? I'm going to make a couple comments with two different hats on. First, as a business owner, I think that every business that is looking at reopening should participate in Beyond 6 Feet, because the learning there is so you learn so much, and it makes you think outside of the box. It takes me out of making pizzas and start to think about things that on my day-to-day I would not think about. So creating the personas, I look at my persona and I look at my fears, and maybe decide we are one of those businesses that have been open with takeout only, but I evaluated the risks versus the rewards of opening my dining room, and I decided that for the foreseeable future, my business is better off not opening for sitting down dining. So that from that perspective alone, never mind all the other things that I'm learning, it's a great program. My other hat is, some of you may know, I'm a technical assistance provider. I run a nonprofit, which is a lender and a technical assistance provider. And one of the things that as a technical assistance provider that we should be stressing to our small businesses is the importance of relationships. And there are 4 major relationships that every small business, every large business should have a great relationship with. And that is with their attorney, with their insurance agent, with their banker, okay? Those are 3 out of 4. The accountant, the banker, the insurance guy, and the attorney, because those are people that are part of your management team. And you need to have that expertise to complement how well you know how to cook a pizza, how well you might be able to put out a product, but there are all these other things that you are not an expert and you need the help of the expert. And the more relationship building you have, for example, I build a relationship for my pizza business with my suppliers. I get what I want from them because of my relationship. A lot of people have landlords. If they had a good relationship with them, it would make that process of communicating with them a lot easier. So relationships is something that as technical assistance provider, we need to stress as we are working with our small businesses.
Thanks, Frank. And I swear neither Hitchendra nor I paid him for his comments about this program. And we know that what he's moving into instead of sit down is essentially something he's very good at, which is being half-baked, which is half-baked pizzas, which I hope we're going to be able to order remotely and have mailed to us frozen, Frank, because I'm going to be pushing those with my friends and relatives all over if you can.
You're muted, Frank.
That's in the works. We need to work out the details.
I I heard you might have an implementation plan you're putting together for that, so that's great. So we are at time here, and we're going to give our guest speaker the last word. So I want to, before we do that, give her our sincere thanks for taking all of these questions about all of these issues that some of which you were prepared for and some of which you might not have been able to anticipate. You've done an amazing job. You're really good at breaking down legal concepts into simple words that people can understand, and you've given a lot of really practical advice tonight. Reminder to go to BizGrow and get a lot more of the same from Priya and a whole bunch of other lawyers that can provide more specific guidance and more extensive guidance on particular topics. And we will share her contact information, the website for her organization, and of course the information about BizGrow in the thank you email, and we will have it posted on our website. Priya, with no further ado, take us out.
This is my piece of advice regardless of time period, but I would say it's never too late or too early to form your legal entity if you haven't. So let's start at like that baseline of protecting ourselves and before spending money on some other stuff, think about spending that $500 on your LLC.
Thank you so much, Priya, and thank you to all of you for being with us, for the great questions. Maria, for doing a great job managing us, notwithstanding our attempts to defy order. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Great session.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Good night.